Hello, good evening, and welcome to the TNT Show. I'm John Drummond, your host for the next 60 minutes. And we have a very exciting 60 minutes coming up. We have two star guests, but more of that in a second. Many of you will be thinking about the results of the US elections. And I don't blame you for having maybe a few sleepless moments, because the reality is that, and listen to this, the White House will be Republican controlled, the Senate, as well as the House of Representatives, and some would argue the Supreme Court is staffed with those who might be considered supportive of the next president, which means that all of the checks and balances, or at least certainly most of them, that are part of the US Constitution would not be effective in the sense that it was intended by the founding fathers. So therefore, the president would have pretty much total control of the US, which is a bit like the UK in many respects, where Steve Stammer doesn't have to worry about the Constitution either, because it pretty much doesn't exist for him. And even if it did, he could change it anytime he wished. We have a president, or a prospective president, scheduled to be signed in many respects at the beginning of January. This is someone who, according to a wife, sleeps with a copy of a book of Hitler's speeches under his pillow. He's a climate denier. He has enormous trouble with women. He thinks that, I'm sure Putin thinks rather, that he's a useful idiot. He's described by some as an Islamophobe. He's definitely a demagogue. He believes in using nuclear weapons. I'm not quite sure what impact that might have on the Clyde. He believes also in tariffs. Now, tariffs are a disaster in many respects, particularly if they're applied unintelligently. And since he's not the most rational person in the world, it's hard to see how there'll be rationality in tariffs either. He's also a convicted felon. So that introduces some complexities. I know people were concerned that John Swinney had indicated support for his opponent, but then again, David Lammy said even worse things about the next prospective president, and no one is criticising him just as yet, at least in the public prints. But the public prints, most regard would regard as being a very inadequate way of reflecting the nation's health and wealth. So there we are, an interesting state of affairs, and who better than our two guests tonight to talk about this, plus the big revive, which is taking place in Perth at 12 p.m. on the 10th of November, at which you're all free to sign up and attend, unless we hear otherwise, and it will be about the big land question. So we're going to be talking about the prospective potential president, and also we'll be talking a lot about the big revive. So without any further ado, may I introduce Lesley Riddoch and Robin McAlpine. Welcome both. How are you?
Well, scared, but good.
You're well. You say you're well?
My health is good. My psychic state is not at its very best today, but there you go.
What about you, Lesley? How are you?
Well, I've just been writing a column about all of this all day, basically, so kind of started off thinking it might just be a great thing to go back to bed, pull the duvet over my head for the next 4 years and come out some other time, So it's astonishing how quick you just have to kind of get yourself together, don't you? And we all have to do that.
What do you think is going to happen in the short term? What do you think his immediate targets might be?
Oh, but I mean, right, let's be clear here. There's two different things with Trump, right? The Americans have voted for Trump. They must live with the consequences. And believe me, I read a phenomenal amount of American politics, but I'm tired of talking about what Americans do to themselves. So what's going to happen in the US? There's going to be further removes on abortion. There's going to be more scrapping of climate legislation, all the bad stuff, a lot of government baiting. But the big worry is that Trump wants to dismantle the federal government and replace it with something which looks more like a right-wing think tank. Now, if he does that, it may be very hard to put it back together again. So what America is going to do to itself is a problem for America. What America is going to do to the rest of the world, now that I do want to talk about, because that is relevant for us.
Okay. Lesley, what's your immediate, I know you want to put your head under a blanket for 4 years, but assuming you're not going to do that in reality, what will your approach be? What's your thinking on all of this?
Well, I mean, as someone who perhaps has a slightly, I hope I haven't just switched myself off there, a sort of Pollyanna tendency to sort of try to see any kind of way forward and stuff. It strikes me that, I mean, what Trump's doing is basically really giving a challenge to Europe. I mean, sadly, we're not in the European Union anymore to be able to deal with any of this. But particularly since actually the Inflation Reduction Act, weirdly for us, named the IRA, was putting, was it $3 trillion into all sorts of renewable infrastructure, energy, etc., and actually had given the Americans quite a lead in all sorts of different technologies that Europe should have been getting on with generally. Now that'll probably be one of the first things that gets axed. And of course, Trump's one of his big slogans was "Drill, baby, drill." So, he's committed, and in his acceptance speech, he did a kind of fairly repellent trilling about, the liquid gold that was sitting there for America in the shape of oil and gas. So, it's going to be a complete switch from him. So that gives a kind of challenge to quite a lot of people. I mean, one to Europe that's slightly been kind of losing the edge on trying to shift completely, particularly given the situation with Russia and Ukraine, away from any dependency on Russian gas and nuclear. But I mean, also there's a challenge to democratic states, actually, because I mean, I remember the last time around when this happened, and I can't remember which COP it was that, Trump had just stormed out of the Paris agreements and wasn't going to come to a COP. And actually, the same number of American delegates turned up because the individual states have got quite a lot of clout within all of this. And particularly states like California were just more in charge, actually, of their own transition in terms of the green transition. So they had turned up pretty much big style. This may be clutching at straws. It is to a large degree. But still, those states, because we are such a kind of centralized state, we have very little appreciation of how much the states within the United States have got some agency, at least, on some of these issues.
Do you think, Robin, it might, taking up Lesley's point, lead to some sort of schism or split in the US, with the so-called liberal states deciding up with this they will not put, despite what the federal government says?
There's really one big question here, which is, does Trump do what he said he was going to do, or does he do what he did the last time? The truth is, the last time Trump did a lot of bad stuff, but it wasn't, apart from the Supreme Court, it wasn't really fundamental. He put a lot of people in a lot of places, but he was surrounded by a lot of people who basically didn't enable him. If he surrounds himself by enablers this time, he could make changes that are so rapid that the US does dissolve. But again, I'm tired of the bloody talking about the US in terms of the US. I want to talk about the US in terms of the rest of the world. And in that regard, I am not so sure that this is long-term bad, unless you're Palestinian. So we've been in a globe clinging to a belief that forever and forever, nothing would ever change. We would all shelter under a benign United States, and everything that happens as a result of that is an inevitability. And it's been deeply unhelpful. It's been really, really unhelpful. And I think the biggest outcome of this is that we might see a Europe which is starting to take itself a bit more seriously in terms of its domestic security. We're going to see a shift to a multipolar world in the United Nations, because the Americans have to put up with this. We don't. We do not have to put up with this crap at a global level. We can negotiate trade deals too. And a lot of people are doing all this already. Do not underestimate how much the BRIC countries are licking their lips at this. And I don't say that as a bad thing. I don't really think that the economic order in Russia, China, Brazil is really so much worse than the economic order in the US. I'm quite happy to buy Chinese solar panels. I don't buy this economic nationalism that this Anglo-American economic nationalism, there's all sorts of shifts and changes which might become possible now. I was just writing a piece. I was just pointing out that not in Britain, though, because I can only phrase it like this, and I'm sorry for the image, but obviously a politician like Keir Starmer had to take the knee when a new US president was elected. But the extent to which he's licking while he's down there is purely his choice. He is really taking this America loving quite far, and I don't think it's clever in domestic politics. So I think we're going to see a lot of change. One thing just to flag up here right now, you might have spotted at the weekend that we had yet another security services placed article in the Herald, some people would say two, but about the absolute necessity for Scotland to cling to nuclear weapons if Trump won. Why are the security services coming out the Sunday before a US election and saying that? Because if we were approaching sane, we would say the following words to ourselves. We would say, Scotland has over 200 nuclear weapons in this country, and the delivery system's targeting system is controlled by Donald Trump. Okay, try that again. 200 nuclear weapons in the country, and Donald Trump's driving them. We should be running. That's why the security services were making up their crazy talk about how, if Trump comes, it's double. The idea that Scotland is going to defend Europe with a nuclear arsenal is barking mad. America controls our nuclear arsenal.
I did say in my initial remarks that he was a climate denier. He's happy to use nuclear weapons. These are his words, not mine. He also has interesting views on tariffs. Lesley, I wonder if I could ask you, Elon Musk, who's a huge supporter of Donald Trump, says that legacy media is dead and that citizen journalism is the future. Do you agree?
Well, as a citizen journalist these days, there's something to that. I was looking at the circulation of the Herald, I think, is down to kind of less than 20,000. And at every meeting I'm at, people get extremely agitated about newspapers that hardly anybody's reading, to be really honest, and which are now behind a paywall for everybody else. So it's not like people could dip in and out and just go, it's a wee bit boring. Yeah. It's just not there for a lot of people. But I just wanted to pick up the wee bit, what Robin was talking about there, because I still run a group called Nordic Horizons, and we had an event. Actually, I'd looked at it in March 2022, which was sort of strangely prophetic, with one of the contributors, Professor Ivar Neumann, who's a Norwegian. And he basically said this, I'm just quoting from it. In 3 to 7 years, less than that, we will have an American president whose foreign policy agenda we know nothing about. He may be isolationist. He may be a gung-ho militarist. What's happening inside the Republican Party in the States is leaving democratic politics behind. With that happening, the way to go is to strengthen EU defense policy. He thinks it's a pity Britain left because it would have something to offer, but he wants to see a sort of non-nuclear umbrella. The amount of money that's going into the NATO kitty, why would you want to put that in to have someone like Trump in charge of it? Of course, since this event happened and over the last 2 years, NATO has also been joined by Finland and Sweden. So there's, the point is, what is the point in kind of raking together this kind of kitty around 2% of GDP to then hand its control? I mean, we're all, most of the conventional media is now terrified about Trump pulling out of NATO. But actually, in many ways, just to sort of echo something Robin's saying there, you should be more worried about the idea that actually that NATO spending is directed by someone with the outlook that Donald Trump has. So many people behind the scenes had been starting to have these conversations some time ago. One of the sticking points, France doesn't want to have any limitations on its nuclear deterrent. Many people don't think the EU is so bureaucratic. Can it possibly step up? But on all of these things now, if there's going to be tariffs, then the EU has to step up and try to sort itself out. On energy, one of the guys who was in a film I made about Denmark, Dan Jorgensen, who's the climate change minister for Denmark, is now up as the, auditioning, as they say, as the EU energy minister. And he is an interesting pick because Denmark's already committed to it's already stopped issuing new oil and gas licenses. It will end oil and gas drilling by 2050. So there's the beginnings. I mean, God knows there's actually a COP summit that starts in Baku in Azerbaijan on Monday. So this is all kind of like coming at 100 miles an hour. I mean, it could well have been anticipated. Spain has just given everyone in Europe another reminder, if it was necessary, that we just can't sort of diddle about on this. So all of the ingredients are there for, at last, the EU to do something that's bold and to take leadership on this. I'm not saying it will, but it's possible.
I think you're right. I worry about the leadership thing, though. Because what seems axiomatic to you and perhaps I, that people should be concerned about climate change. When I look at the Spanish example, I spent a lot of time in the last week looking at the floods in Valencia. And one of the things that struck me, well, two things really, was a complete absence of national politicians. The second thing that struck me was when they did turn up, mob-handed with the king and the queen, the politicians departed the scene tout de suite. They left the two royals to be covered in mud from irate protesters. The politicians afterwards said these were right-wing fanatics. I'm not so sure about that. I listened, because my Spanish is more than a little bit rudimentary now, and they seem to be saying, we were left here. You left us. And now you turn up when there's a camera. And we resent that, because you're treating us like fools. And I worry how much of that sentiment, i.e. this lack of connection to political leadership, is maybe at the base of a lot of the troubles that we're seeing. Anyway, let's park that.
Can I just add into this a couple of things, which is, in principle, I agree with all of this. But one thing to warn you is that pretending that Europe is a unified and effective entity just now, not half, but about a quarter of Europe is Trump aligned. I mean, we've got a large proportion of Trump-oriented voters. I mean, apparently 25% in Scotland, although I'm a bit sceptical at that poll. So it's not like we are separate from them. The second thing that I was going to say was the best thing about a European military alliance is that it'd be completely useless. Now, when I say that, what I mean is we wouldn't particularly need one. This is the thing that I think is really important. We're in conflict with people for America. If it hadn't been for America, we would have probably integrated Russia into the European security architecture after 1990. In fact, people are really ignorant about this, but the actual international politics people, they've documented extensively how it was 100% American intervention that prevented outreach to Russia to bring Russia into a European security alliance.
Sorry, you mean Ukraine? You mean intervention in Ukraine?
No, forget Ukraine. This is 30 years ago. When communism fell, the dominant view in Europe was that they wanted to integrate Russia into Europe. It's on the continent. It's there forever. They wanted to bring them in. The Americans said, under no circumstances, we are not having Russia in NATO because we still compete with them. And it was America that was pushing the isolation of Russia on the continent of Europe. Now, if it wasn't for the US, we wouldn't have done that. And if it wasn't for the fear of Russia, we wouldn't be at conflict with anybody. We wouldn't have been involved in any overseas wars. Our only fear is our eastern flank, and we created that fear. So I think the great opportunity for Europe isn't so much security collaboration, but it's the need to not need security collaboration anymore. Just one thing I did want to say, though, anybody, and this is not going to be popular with many of your viewers, I'm sure, but anyone who's celebrating the end of mainstream or legacy media will regret it. The reason Trump got elected is precisely because the media which they are reading, the citizen journalism that they are reading, is bleeding insane. It's way over the score mental. And say what you want. The flaws in the old mainstream media was enormous, but there was regulation which stopped outright lies. The mainstream media manipulated you, but outright lies were rare. Now, manipulation's your job to deal with. Outright lies we can't cope with.
Yeah.
Outright lies are driving on the media sources that Trump supporters reading. Outright lies are driving this to happen. Do not celebrate.
Let's maybe come back to that later. Let's not miss the opportunity to talk about what you immediately want to talk about right now, which is Big Revive. Lesley, tell us about Big Revive, why it's important, why people should come along, and why they should listen. What's it all about? Tell us in detail, please.
Well, it's the big land question by the Revive Coalition, but indeed it could be a big revive. The Revive Coalition people would probably know more, because these are the guys that basically, it's been a coalition, I can't remember offhand because it's not my gig, if you like. Revive is a coalition of mostly wildlife and environmental people and charities that have come together to try and change a situation where a fifth of Scotland is a driven grouse moor. I mean, that to just even have got that statistic readily into people's minds is a pretty useful thing. They've also been looking at all the things that flow from keeping that amount of land basically to just shoot to pieces small birds, which also means that you have to poison anything that might go for the grouse. So that is birds of prey, hares, all sorts of competitors on the grouse moor, if you like. And they've been highlighting the really shocking stuff that's going on because, most of us don't go padding around grouse moors. So I think people don't know. So that's the story to date. And they did get, some concessions out of the Scottish government, not as much as they wanted to, about regulation of grouse moors and some of the worst practices now being stopped in principle. So they've kind of been, I always had a bit of a thing where, if you look at the history of the clearances, the Highland clearances, my lot came from Caithness, my family a few generations back were cleared. It's always been, there's been a hierarchy of what matters in Scotland. And basically animals of various sorts have come, generally speaking, higher than locals. Now, I don't mean that the Cheviot sheep basically felt the benefit of being let rip across much of the Highlands. But if it wasn't that, there's been, if you like, a kind of ecology of value, which has generally placed local people at the bottom. And we are still in this ludicrous position that Andy Whiteman has recalculated, where I think it is now that 433 people own half the private land of Scotland. And just to remind everybody, that's utterly weird. It's the most concentrated land ownership in the developed world, perhaps teetering into the rest of the world in its concentration. So the Revive Coalition is now looking at the land question in all its hoary sort of form, which is its impact on people. And they've made the very reasonable point that anybody who has principally started off being involved in this because of their care for animals would ask themselves why, on a whim, one man usually can decide that vast, up to 1% of the landmass of Scotland can be set aside simply to allow him and his pals to blast grouse to pieces and sell us the idea, the wrong idea, that we're living in an utterly barren wasteland that wouldn't be capable of any other kind of land use.
Robin, do you want to add to that?
Well, I'll just add that Commonweal is one of the Revive Coalition partners. So I've been organising the conference, and one of the things which I think is which I'm quite excited about for it, is now, obviously, for a very long time, I have believed in land reform on a straightforward social justice basis. It's wrong. It's wrong that a small group of super rich people own your entire country and can control the physical nature of your nation. But the problem for me was always partly that what tends to happen is people say, yes, that's an injustice, how terrible, and then move on. What we're trying to do with this conference is try to say to people, now stop and pause and think what it would look like if it was different. What would it look like if the land was more equally owned? What would you do? At one point, I don't think we're actually doing it now, but I'd suggested a session which was just called, so I think it's an average 2-point-something hectares per Scot. And the question was, what would you do with your 2 hectares? If you had a fair share of Scotland, what would you do with it? Put up a cabin, plant some trees, grow a harvest, have a plot, visit, rewild? What? Start a small land-based business? What would you do?
Let me just stop there for a second, and we'll come back to that. A lot of people watching tonight will be thinking, hold on a second, we've had a Scottish government for yonks now. Didn't they have any authority over the land? Couldn't they have implemented some legislation of some kind to equalise things? What have they been doing for all these years? What's the answer to that?
They have implemented legislation. I've got to say, this makes me extremely annoyed, because at the time, as each of these bits of legislation was kind of proposed, I must say, I wrote about it, and doubtless Robin did the same, that they would make absolutely no impact on things at all, because they were so incredibly complicated. Let me give you just one example. I wrote a book cycling up the Western Isles, the Outer Hebrides, 15 years ago, and it needed to be updated. So I went back across everything I'd written and discovered cheerfully that most of the land on the Western Isles now had gone from being privately owned estates to actually community controlled. Great. There was one wee one in the midst of it all that just caught my eye, which is Great Bernera, which is an island off Uig on the west of Lewis. And these guys had basically tried in 2005, they had begun moves to try to get a community buyout from a very kind of canny landowner in Germany who basically played them along. And they tried to use a piece of legislation. Its precise name has gone from me at the moment, but it was one of the pieces of crofting buyout legislations to try and get forward with that. So that's 2005 they've started. They're still at it.
Yeah.
And they have got nowhere with it, partly because it involves all sorts of requirements to map minutely every square inch of the land, which can easily be gainsaid and contradicted by a landowner who will have better mapping. And they just get lost in that process, as everyone predicted.
Why was that? Is that due to the incompetence of the civil service, or what?
Just to say that same mechanism was going to be used by people in Balalan Park. People may know of that buyout. And they ended up, they wrestled with it for years, and in the end came to a private agreement with the landowner. So no one has used that mechanism. 2003, that is 21 years of no use whatsoever.
But why was it drafted in those terms, Lesley?
Ended up doing something similar. So we had one in 2015, 2016, which was about an ability for people to involve ministers if they could accuse a landowner of basically negligence and problems that meant their lives weren't sustainable. Again, I'm pretty sure not a single person has used that. And before you, the reason I'm thundering on over the top of you both is because it's important that people realize that's how utterly freaking useless those bits of legislation have been. You could now ask, why are we putting up with this? But it's partly because people don't, time has passed, and there's the evidence. When these bits of stuff are being proposed, people don't know enough about land and the way it's used in general for them to be able to spot the obvious problems, which boil down to this, that politicians require communities to be braver than they are. Yeah. And not ever going to work.
John, can I give you an example?
Just 2 seconds, Robin. This is a theme that crops up on this program time and time again. It manifests itself in different forms, and you'll probably recognize all of this. One is over-centralisation, i.e. that Scotland is run from the centre and nobody really cares what happens out there. We've had people from the islands with loads of great ideas about how to improve their communities. They have to travel 200 miles. It takes a day and a half there and back simply to stand up at the council and be ignored. Then they go all the way back again. And they know what needs to be done. It's not a question of this is rocket science. This is pretty straightforward stuff. And there's so many people have come on this program and said, look, we need to decentralise the whole political arrangements here. It would be an entirely practical thing to do, and we don't understand why it doesn't get done. Robin, fire away.
You basically just described my whole life. But what's quite fun for me is when it was just the 10th birthday of Commonweal, and when I had to come up with the things that we achieved, and I was trying to point out sometimes changing the conversations part of it. And if I had to pick something which I'm quite chuffed with, one of them was the fact that in 2014, when we kicked off, if you talked to people about the problem of over-centralising Scotland, they didn't really intuitively, it wasn't in the political conversation, and now nobody doesn't recognise it. So, I mean, 100%, that's our whole thing, is if we disempower...
sorry, you say everyone recognises it. The politicians don't.
But they recognise it, they just don't do anything about it. But let me... What I really wanted to do was to address your question. Why is this legislation not having any effect? And I want to tell you about the current, we're negotiating with them just now. Now, what I'm about to do is a slightly fictionalized version of an actual conversation we had. Your new legislation, any land sale over 3,000 hectares can be called in by the Scottish Government to find out if it's in the public interest. Right. What happens if the landowner splits it up into 2 sales of 1,500 hectares, and the civil servant was, oh man, those wily landowners, you can't stop them, can you? We said, are you deliberately building loopholes into this legislation so it won't reform land? Oh no, we're definitely not doing that. But you did in the last one, didn't you? Oh no, we meant well with it. They'll work. People were telling them at the time this legislation isn't going to work. It's not going to have any effect. Right? The purpose of the legislation was to not reform land. So the pressure was on. You asked, Lesley asked, why do people put up with this? They don't. The SNP's party membership has been pushing in land reform consistently for its whole existence, but certainly over the last 10 years. And every time it pushes, the Scottish Government introduces a piece of fake land reform legislation. Every time it gets passed, nothing happens. So the pressure grows within inside the party again. And we're on our 3rd phase of this in 10 years. And the big measure, and this is what I'm trying to tell everybody. Here's the measure to find out if land reform legislation is working. Land will have been reformed. Has it been? No. So legislation isn't working. In fact, worse than that, again, if we were going into this, right now, the Scottish Government has made it substantially worse. Land in Scotland is becoming more concentrated because they introduced what I've been calling the PFI for trees scheme. So what they've done is they've basically found a way to harvest tax credits from down south and give massive loans to private landowners or investors to buy Scottish land, plant trees on it, and harvest all the public sector grants. This is increasing the value of rural land in Scotland way outside the affordability of communities, of small businesses, of land-based businesses, of farmers. It's not that the Scottish Government's making it better.
People will be asking, Robin, since it's so blindingly evident that this is a mess, how come nobody's doing anything about it? I mean, we've got elected politicians, they sit there in Holyrood, nothing seems to get changed. I mean, either you believe that the civil servants are completely incompetent, or you believe that they're acting in an unethical way. I'm not quite sure.
Civil servants were told not to produce effective legislation.
So the politicians told them.
The politicians are scared. If I'm allowed to say this just now.
Scared of whom?
Right, so I don't know whether to name names or not, but let's just say a very, very... Oh, look, it was Nicola Sturgeon actually said to somebody that told me this, says, I can't do land reform, they'll call me McGabby. That's the reason. Look, land reformers are radical. I'm not going to be a radical. I am not going to have Scotland's establishment looking down on me like a wild populist. I am not reforming land. That's why they're not doing it. That's why they're scared. They're scared to take on the big landowners. That's the whole reason. The flip side of this is that there is not enough pressure. This is why this conference is happening. There is not enough pressure from the public. The public sees this as a matter of principle, but not of daily practice, right? So they see this as being wrong, but not something that's holding Scotland back just now. And what we've got to start doing is showing them that no, this is holding Scotland back, right? So it's affecting our economy. It's affecting the economies of rural Scotland. It's affecting our profitability, our productivity, our investability, our environmental performance, everything. All of it is being held back by this. So we've got to say this is social justice and a live policy issue. And that's what we're trying to do just now. But the truth is, the Scottish Parliament broadly, generally, has got itself into a terrible funk. And what we're describing here is kind of the picture across the board. Poor quality legislation limping its way through unenthusiastically, and nobody really standing up and saying, this isn't actually good enough. We need to strengthen this and fix it. So the National Care Service, it's NHS reform, it's the justice reforms, it's everything that's going through Parliament just now. Is not great legislation with no great ambition to it.
Can I just say that the other, what I'd heard was also, and it did actually date from Nicola Sturgeon, but you've got to say there wasn't, it didn't get a lot better before her, that they deeply believe that any attempt to interfere with landowners' property rights will contravene the European Convention of Human Rights. And, a lot of them have said this, that kind of really we should have got on with this before the era of property rights. Now, I've pointed out to them and to Nicola herself that actually much the same was said when the Scottish government adopted minimum alcohol pricing, because, the white alcohol industry was absolutely determined to crush that. It had huge resources. It took the Scottish government to every court in this country and to the European Court and then to the Supreme Court. And for whatever reasons, it could be, some influence from a woman who sadly died, Evelyn Gillan, who was quite an influential character with Nicola Sturgeon, that they just stuck to their guns and did that. So the trouble with that is that it shows and demonstrates quite clearly that you can actually take everybody on, even when the rights side of it looks extremely stacked against you. And the second thing, to answer your question, is the second thing I've heard that was said was that basically at one point that if Andy Whiteman and myself had been knocked over, there would be nobody left who really cared about land reform. And
this is really important. They do not believe anybody cares. And the problem is that there's this problem in a range of politics, and it's to do with the difference between how strongly you think something is wrong versus how actively you think it must be addressed. So, for example, a lot of people might actively think that monarchy is wrong, but if you said to them, you can do 5 things this week, abolish the monarchy isn't one of them because it's not really affecting them that day, that moment. The problem with land reform is we've polled it. It polls massively overwhelmingly. Give people the basic facts and they say, that's wrong, we need to change that. But then if you follow up and you say, okay, so we can do 5 things this week, land reform doesn't crop up because people don't experience it as a live issue. Land reform is the perfect example of a subject on which you need leadership. And the leadership is in the wrong direction. They do indeed talk about the human rights of possession. Now, first of all, I've been through this. We've published a report with the New Economics Foundation in London, and we just cited case study where land was reformed in Europe under the European Human Rights Act with no difficulty whatsoever. And see, compulsory purchase of land, which is to depossess people of the property. Scottish government's doing it right now for the A9. They do it all the time. It's constant. It's a ludicrous. That was an argument for them not doing the thing that they didn't want to do for other reasons, and that was their excuse.
Lesley, don't you think this is taking up Robin's point? There seems to be a very general concern right across the board that we seem to have a government that's got deaf ears when it comes to people's primary concerns. Also, it seems to be wedded to this notion that when it comes to the Constitution, the best place to be is in the middle. When it comes to economics, the best place to be and it's in the middle. Don't frighten the horses. Don't make anyone terribly upset because there will be ramifications. They get into a situation where the Scottish Parliament decides, for example, that they want a bottle return scheme. A bunch of Tories who've been influenced by lobbyists and perhaps even finance from outside decides otherwise, and they capitulate. They say, well, that's the Constitution, we can't do anything about it. Surely the whole point of being an independence type party is that you're not going to accept what somebody somewhere says about your sovereignty. You're going to, in fact, resist it. Have I got that completely wrong?
Well, the way I look at it is that really the SNP are a British party.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean that they have as a template in their thinking that big is beautiful. and that corporate is great, and that little people doing voluntary things in the corner is pretty useful, but that kind of things like cooperatives and, you know, anything like that is just open-toed, sandaled sort of, you know, bullshit, basically.
Yeah.
And that's why I spent a lot of my time, you know, looking at Nordic countries, where in Finland, for example, cooperatives are a pretty mainstream way to run absolutely everything.
Yeah.
We are the odd ones out. We're archaic in Britain, and I'm afraid Scotland's no different. And unless you've actually spent some of your life in another country to see what their normals are, and then as a result begun to realize how utterly weird and likely to instantly reject anything that begins to chunk power down to people we've become, you would accept just the incremental changes the SNP have just made over the last however many 17 years as being sort of good enough.
Yeah.
But that's why I've spent so much time trying to put really quite minute levels of detail into films about the way that other countries operate, because that's normal. It's also successful. If you want to be a capitalist, it's also AAA credit rated, which Britain isn't anymore. And these things all actually work. And yet, when you start trying to discuss these different ways of working here, and I showed that Denmark film actually to MSPs in the parliament who were actually disturbingly gobsmacked actually at stuff that you would have thought they should know. You're beginning to hit against all sorts of, I don't want to say ignorance, but I mean, you can only have one life. And if you spend it in Scotland thinking that Britain is normal, then you're not going to be able to see the way forward.
Just 2 seconds, please. I had that distinct feeling when I interviewed Stephen Flynn on the show, and I asked him, where does sovereignty lie in the UK? And he told me it lay with Westminster, and Westminster had overall control of the state. And I said, do you think the Scottish people are sovereign? He said, but that's a different thing. And I thought, well...
He's right. He is right.
He is right. But
constitutionally, it is actually in charge of absolutely everything. The thing that it might be more useful to say is, let's just look around us at how unusual that is. Right? Precisely. And that's another issue, which, anyway, Robin wants to...
John, can I tell you how you know? Now, I've been trying to argue this with a lot of the people who are calling for UDI, right? Who's in charge isn't theoretical, it's practical. So here's my question. Can we switch off England's grid, or can they switch off our grid, electricity grid? The correct answer to that is they can switch off ours, we can't switch off them. That answers your question, right? So
not entirely, because the SNP recognise
they can legally switch.
The SNP recognise that there's a moral imperative here, and it's an important moral imperative, because you can't have two constitutions, you can't have two sovereigns in the same place. So you have to get rid of one or the other. And the way the SNP decided to do this was to have a constitutional convention. And I've asked Stephen Flynn, and I've asked many others, who's in charge of the constitutional convention? Where will it take place? When will it take place? Answer is there none. Because you have to explain to the Scottish people, increasing numbers of whom believe that they are sovereign, right? Whether it be a legal status or not, that's what they believe. And you can't address that by ignoring it. I
encourage people to be careful about allowing slogans to turn into what they think is legal. Are the Scottish people sovereign? Yes, at Holyrood elections. Yes, at local government elections. But come a general election, the British people are sovereign. That's how it works. Sovereignty is the right to choose your leadership, and Scotland doesn't get to choose its own leadership, but only up to a certain level. Are we in principle sovereign? Should we be? Yes. Are we legally? No. So stop worrying about these things.
No, sorry. No, you can't get away with it that easily. That either there is a moral point or there isn't. Of course, we could discuss the legal niceties. But the reality is, if somebody believes ethically and morally and in every conceivable sense of that particular perspective, that they have a reasonable point, you can't dismiss it by saying, well, look, you live in a different legal environment to the one that you prefer. But that's the whole point of nationalism, it seems to me.
It was immoral that we were arresting and jailing men for homosexuality into the 1970s, but it was still the law.
It's not now, and it changed.
I know, but the law currently is not there. The current law
Hold on a second. We've gone round in circles here, Robin. Yes, Lesley.
What I'm trying to say is it's a bit like the argument that came to a head with the Supreme Court judgment as to whether or not the Scottish Parliament had the legal power to consult its own people about anything. I mean, okay, independence, but like anything. What's your favourite colour even? And actually, anything that is seen to impinge upon the primacy of the sovereignty of Westminster is just right out the window. And actually, the reason that this, to me, that is actually that gets me mad as hell, right? Because it makes me realize something very deep about the structure of the state. So that, as everybody has said, we've got a pretendy parliament. Yeah. And so, for example, that also gives you a difficulty, because the way the SNP would want to run it, and I guess if I was them, I might be the same, is to say, look at the big things we've managed to do. Yeah. So there's a point at which you have to say, but it can't be big things because they're pulling your strings, right? So I think the reason this all matters is that we're not in a groovy state like Denmark, where Iceland and Greenland the Faroes and Greenland can just pull down powers when they feel they want to. We're stuck in a uniquely shit situation here. But anyway, that's a bit by the by as far as things to do with that reform are concerned.
It's either a model or it's immoral. It's as simple as that. You said it's a model. Yes, Robert.
Can I combine your 2 points? And let me merge in an earlier conversation. You were asking, why is the SNP so cautious and what does that mean in relation to sovereignty? Right. Politics is about governing, but it's also about telling a story. The story that you tell is crucial to what happens next. So what the SNP is doing and has been doing is exactly what the Kamala Harris campaign did, which is centrist, cautious triangulation. If we keep the maximum number of people happy, we will get the maximum outcome. That's okay if the maximum number of people are currently happy with the status quo. If the maximum number of people aren't currently happy with the status quo, or you want to change the status quo, you have to do something else. Now, to answer the question, the SNP, this is not a Salmond Sturgeon thing, right? This is just a different political approaches. The point about Salmond was he was a risk taker, and Salmond would carve new political space. But to carve new political space, you have to take chances, right? And they've got to be clever chances, and you've got to execute them well. Now, to answer your question, with the best will in the world, if Scotland was sovereign, we wouldn't be having this conversation just now. Scotland was sovereign. The people of Scotland were sovereign. We'd be independents by now, right? If we could just do it ourselves, but we can't. That's what I'm trying to say. We can't. Okay, but we can behave as if. And what you've got to do is if you want out your cage, you've got to push yourself against the bars and say, fucking let me out. And what we are doing is cowering in the corner saying, look how neat we've kept our cage. Our cage is so neat. Could we get a bigger cage, please? Right? We shouldn't be doing that. We should be smashing at the cage. I'm not saying don't make the cage.
You're preaching to the choir here. And it's, by and large, I think it's roughly in tune with what you said, Lesley, about the SNP is primarily a British party. Because it accepts the structure. It accepts the cage. It doesn't seek to change the cage. Is that right?
Well, yes, except I mean, it strikes me it's a lot easier to get your mojo up and to get motoring when you've got a very clear alternative vision of what you could and should be doing. And that's the bit that's missing from my experience of talking to all MSPs. Not enough of them have had a life. Yes. If you like, for starters, a lot of them have been in offices and so on. But secondly, they haven't actually put themselves about to see how other similar sized countries operate. So with all of those things removed from their experience, then you could think that jogging along a bit, I'm sorry, I am sort of exaggerating for effect, is as good as it gets. And if you ain't got a vision, I mean, if you get up in the morning and you've got nothing that day, you can get a wee bit, easily sort of, you can go around in circles. If you've got to get out for a dental appointment, you're out of the house like a blooming whippet. You've got somewhere to go, you've got a deadline. I just don't get any sense of urgency from these guys.
Let me ask you a straightforward question about symbolism, and maybe you want to answer this as well, Robin. I was absolutely astonished when I saw the First Minister in photographs and film material with a group of people around Keir Starmer who were talking about making better cities in England. And he was there. I don't know quite what he was representing. He sounded like a sort of rather overinflated
do you mean the Nations and Regions meeting, John?
Sorry?
Do you mean the Nations and Regions meeting?
Yeah. I mean, that's a nonsense title for a start, but yeah, let's accept it. Were you mystified by that, or was it simply me? I just found that peculiar.
Well,
I can tell you that I've taken readings in that one, and everyone was disappointed. That's all I can tell you. Nobody liked that at all. Nobody liked that.
Why did he do it? I didn't understand the logic of it.
Because it was the centrist thing to do, right? So the safe thing to do was not to take the first opportunity and pick a fight with the UK. The clever thing to do was to think carefully about what story you're telling. And it was a tricky, because it was a bit of a trap, but I would have said, I will sit down with the nations of the UK, but you wouldn't sit down with the regions of Europe. And just try to make it clear that you're happy to work as an equal nation across a nation of equals in the UK. But I'd have told them early on and in private, we are not sitting down with local authorities. But the bigger problem in all of this is the whole point about what you're both saying is you've got to be telling a story about what you're for. And that story, everything that you do in politics is telling a story. And that story said, look at us, put a leash on, bail us, we're not going to cause any trouble, we're not going to make a fuss, I'll stand here for a selfie. Now, that's not a good story to be telling. The problem with the SNP has been that, first of all, it started telling stories thinking it didn't need to follow through. So I was having a conversation with somebody who said the big error in the general election was that all of our internal polling was telling us that the big issue was cost of living. And we didn't major on cost of living during the general election. And I said, oh, yes, you did. You did. You went the other way. You opposed a tax on price gouging during a cost of living crisis. Now, this is the thing I'm trying to explain to the SNP. For the longest time, they thought they could have it all. They could legislate right, talk left, keep everybody happy, and roll us towards independence. But 10 years later, the sum of all of that is disappointment. The sum of it all is promises that weren't followed through and confusion because the story being told and the outcomes didn't match.
Some people have said that John Swinney looks at politics through the wrong end of a municipal drain pipe. Would you agree with that?
Well, could I just say something a bit different to that, which is that, I've been involved in setting a new campaign up called Build a Local Scotland. It's not very sexy, but it is absolutely trying to do what it says on the tin, because we now have the largest so-called local government in the world, bar one country, right? That's how off-beam this is. It's as off-beam as the land issue. Yeah. And it strikes me these two things are related because we've got so feudal in our brains. We've got so used to power never being with us or anywhere near us that we'll accept this being, this nonsense. Now, it comes to John Swinney joining the Nations and Regions things. It wasn't actually a case that it was English local government. It was the combined authorities, a very specific set of 19 kind of amalgamated councils that let you slot in someone like Andy Burnham at the top of it, which in turn sit on top of local councils who also weren't at that meeting, right? Now, that's kind of complicated to explain, but there's ways to make it simpler. And the net of it was that Glasgow and Edinburgh, big thumping great cities, were not included in that event. Now, John Swinney chose not to highlight that, which I thought was pitiful. He was basically then just joining in the narrative, which is that there's, that Glasgow and Edinburgh, it's not important enough.
Exactly.
These cities are included. So he was both being demoted by sitting beside combined authority metro mayors like Andy Burnham, and at the same time not sticking up for large metropolitan areas like Glasgow and Edinburgh.
That's my point.
Now, I know it's kind of, I wrote a column about this, it takes some time to explain all of this, and yet this is where we're at. So that's my disappointment with them, is that constantly there's moments which like that, he had the limelight. People were conscious that a Labour-run Edinburgh and an SNP-run Glasgow were both equally annoyed at being excluded. So you'd kind of got one of these rare moments of something kind of slightly cross the constitutional divide.
That's my point.
And he didn't use it.
Of course, it's my point about looking at politics through the wrong end of a municipal drain pipe. It's very narrow. It's very
wrong with municipal drain pipes. If we had stuck to municipal organisation, I'm just picking you up on that, John.
Yeah.
We would have a lot in common with all. That's the key to the Nordic success.
Yeah,
it's small municipal government. So don't talk bad. Don't talk down about municipal drain pipes. I'm not interested in that analogy. I'm saying simply that John Swinney should have stuck up for the cities, and he didn't.
Yeah, I think we all agree on that. We've only got a couple of minutes left. Robin, you've got 90 seconds, and then Lesley's got 90 seconds. Just to summarize the last few points.
Right, okay. Let me try and take all three themes we've discussed, which is the SNP is failing to give people a sense that it's creating the political space which gives us hope that anything is going to happen or change in the near future, along with the fact that Scotland's land is woefully unequally distributed, and we've just seen a devastating election result in the US in which extremism has just tanked centrism. If you put this together, the answer is that the SNP needs to create some political space by abandoning its scaredy cat centrism and identifying some steps which it can make, which can carve out the political space to make Scotland believe that it's got an opportunity or a chance to be more than this, to be better than this, because that's what drives people forward and makes them believe. And if they're looking for a subject for that, I would certainly suggest they should look at housing. I would greatly encourage them to look at decentralisation, local government, and real community empowerment. And I would tell them that the symbolism of taking some big swings at Scotland's unjust land ownership and turning it into a story about Scotland being a colony for wealthy shooters from London who come up and have got more of the bloody land of Scotland than we've got, and pushing that as a story, it might make for an interesting start on a new era for the SNP in which it wasn't scared of its shadow.
Yeah, good advice, SNP. Lesley?
Well, just looking again at other countries, Estonia, first time it became independent, 1918, land reform. Finland, 1917, land reform. All these countries, in fact, many of them didn't need to do land reform because they already had such widespread ownership of land. But the places that didn't, they got onto it. Weirdly, post the Second World War, Japan, land reform, instigated by the Americans because they could see that the emperor had far too much control over that key aspect of people's lives. So this is kind of, everybody else got to this really fast. And it's the other way around, I think, now, that people that are used to modeling decision-making in their own lives on their own land are easily able to take in their stride the concept of running their own country. And actually, it's a blooming miracle to me that 50% of Scots want independence when with massive councils we don't run and massive landed estates we don't own, we have none of that experience. So come to the Revive thing if you possibly can in Perth on Sunday. It'll be, I hope, a big sort of kickstart with all the sorts of awkward squad there that you need in order to make something happen.
Thank you both very much indeed. A real pleasure as always. I'm just going to make a few concluding remarks. If you can stick around for a couple of seconds afterwards, I'd be very grateful. So there you are, everyone. Good advice. Head up to Perth on Sunday and you'll hear from some really interesting people about some really interesting things. You've had a taster tonight. I strongly urge you to get along. If you can't, because sometimes circumstances don't enable you to go somewhere you particularly like to go, you can see the whole show on Indie Live. How's that? What could be better than that? We've offered you all the choices you could possibly conceive of in order to take part in the conference. But I hope you'll be thinking too about some of the wider points that were made by our guests tonight. So without any further ado, I'd just like to thank them for being with us tonight, and also to thank you for joining us, and also to say, look out next week. We'll be talking to, hopefully, for Anna from Barcelona, and hopefully we'll get some insights into, as Lesley was underscoring, how things are done elsewhere, because I can guarantee you we could surely use that information. We just don't have enough of it. Thanks again, everyone. Good night. Take care. Stay safe and look after each other.